The floorboards in my cabin don't just creak anymore. They groan, like an old man settling into his bones for the last time. It's a sound I've gotten used to out here on the edge of Pine Creek, where the town's worries are supposed to fade into the endless whisper of the fir trees. I bought this place to forget the badge, the paperwork, and the faces of the people I couldn't help. For 10 years, it almost worked. The quiet was a thick blanket I pulled over my head, and the whiskey on the shelf was a lullaby for the memories that refused to sleep. I'd spend my days fixing fences that didn't need mending and my nights staring into the fire, watching the past turn to ash. It was a fragile peace, and I knew it. A peace that could be shattered by a single phone call. That call came on a Tuesday, the air sharp with the promise of a cold autumn. The name on the screen was one I hadn't seen in years, Pine Creek Police Department. I let it ring 3 times before my thumb, acting on old instinct, swiped to answer. The voice was younger, sharper than the one I was used to. Mike Kowalski, the man who'd taken my office, my desk, and the headaches that came with them. He was polite but distant. The way you talk to a town relic you're obligated to respect. "Wes," he started, no preamble. "We've got a situation. A kid's gone missing. Jacob Grayson, 14. The name hung in the air between us, heavy and cold. He was giving me a courtesy call, nothing more. A professional nod to the old guard. But for me, it wasn't a courtesy. It was a ghost rattling its chains. The silence in my cabin was gone, replaced by the roar of a past I'd tried to bury. I didn't need Kowalski's permission to drive to the search perimeter. My old pickup rattled over the gravel road leading to the trailhead off Route 9, the same place it had all started a decade ago. Yellow tape was already strung between the ponderosa pines, a garish, unnatural color against the deep green and brown of the forest. I saw the search party fanning out, their orange vests like scattered autumn leaves. I saw Jacob's mother, her face a mask of pale terror, clutching a school photo. I saw Kowalski directing his deputies, his jaw tight. I stayed back, leaning against the fender of my truck, my eyes scanning the ground. And then I saw it, the tracks. A clear set from a teenager's sneakers heading toward the old logging path. They went on for about 50 feet, then they just stopped. No sign of a struggle, no scuff marks, no other prints. They ended in the middle of the path as if the boy had been plucked straight into the sky. It was the exact same pattern, the same impossible vanishing act. I walked over to Kowalski, keeping my voice low. "You see how they end? It's the same, just like the others." He gave me a thin, tired smile. "Wes, I appreciate you coming out, but we've got this handled. Probably just circled back through the brush. We'll find him." He was wrong. I knew he was wrong because I had followed those same kinds of tracks 10 years ago, and they had led me to nothing but grief and a career I could no longer stomach. The new department, with its fresh-faced deputies and by-the-book chief, saw me as a ghost of Pine Creek's past, a man haunted by cold cases. Kowalski was a good cop, methodical and thorough, but he didn't know these woods. He didn't know the stories the old-timers told, the ones they stopped telling when city folks started buying up the cabins. He saw a missing kid. I saw a debt coming due. I let him dismiss me, nodding as he explained his grid search patterns and the call he'd put in for canine units. I let him think I was just a retired sheriff who couldn't let go. As the sun began to dip below the ridge, casting long skeletal shadows through the trees, I walked the perimeter one last time, my gaze sweeping the undergrowth. My foot caught on something just at the edge of the woods, half buried in pine needles. I knelt, brushing the debris away. It wasn't a rock or a root. It was a small, twisted effigy. The body was carved from a piece of pale pine bark, its limbs thin and jagged. Its head was the bleached, hollowed-out vertebra of a deer, and it was bound together with what looked like dried sinew. It was deliberately placed, a morbid little sentinel guarding the path. I'd never seen anything like it. It felt ancient, wrong. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air crawled up my spine. I wrapped it carefully in my handkerchief and slipped it into my pocket, my mind racing. This wasn't part of the old pattern. This was new. This was a message. That night, the whispers started up again in town. I heard them when I stopped at the diner for a coffee I didn't want. Hushed conversations in booths, nervous glances toward the windows that looked out into the unending darkness. They were talking about sounds from the forest after dark. Not animal cries, not the wind. They called them earth groans, a low, grinding moan that seemed to come from the ground itself, a deep, resonant rumble like something massive was shifting in its sleep beneath the soil. The old-timers nodded sagely, their faces grim. They had heard it before. It was a sound that meant the ground was hungry. I left the diner with the whispers clinging to me like a shroud, the totem a cold weight in my pocket. Sleep was a long time coming that night. I sat on my porch, the bottle of whiskey finally open, staring at the black wall of the forest. Around midnight, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A figure, tall and shrouded in a heavy dark coat, was standing at the edge of my property, just beyond the reach of the porch light. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, a pillar of shadow against the trees. I reached for the shotgun I kept propped by the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. But as my fingers closed around the cool metal, the figure turned and melted back into the woods as silently as they had appeared. My hand trembled slightly as I lowered the gun. I stayed there for another hour, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. When I finally went to lock up, I saw it. Lying on the top step of my porch, gleaming in the pale moonlight, was an amulet. It was made of silver, heavy and cold to the touch. Etched into its surface was a symbol I'd never seen before. A perfect circle, with a knot of swirling, tentacle-like lines writhing in its center. It wasn't a threat. It felt like an answer. Or maybe an invitation. The morning after finding the amulet, I woke with the silver circle cold against my chest. I'd put the chain around my neck without thinking, a talisman against a fear I couldn't name. The sun was weak, filtering through the pines in hazy shafts of light that did little to burn off the oppressive sense of dread. I was nursing a cup of black coffee on the porch when a battered-looking station wagon, a model from at least 20 years ago, rumbled up my driveway. It coughed to a stop, and 3 figures emerged. They moved with a shared purpose that immediately set my teeth on edge. These weren't locals or lost tourists. The first was a man who looked to be in his late 50s, with a face like a worn road map and eyes that had seen too much. He introduced himself as Mark Donovan, his voice a low gravel. The second was a woman, younger and wiry, with a network of pale, shiny burn scars crawling up her forearms from beneath her flannel sleeves. Her name was Laura Fitch, and she moved with a bird-like alertness, her gaze constantly scanning the woods around my cabin. The last was a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, with a lank shock of dark hair and a profoundly empty stare. His name, Mark said, was Andrew Neal. They didn't offer handshakes. They just stood there, a grim-faced trinity on my lawn, with Mark holding up a silver amulet identical to the one I was wearing. "We figured you'd be the one who found our welcome gift," Mark said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're a long way from home," I said, my hand instinctively resting on the shotgun just inside the door. "What do you want?" Mark's gaze was unflinching. "We're not here for the boy," he said, and the certainty in his voice chilled me more than the morning air. "Not directly. We're here for what took him. We're here for the thing that wakes up when the ground gets cold. The creature that slumbers under the weight of last year's snow." I stared at him, my skepticism warring with the totem in my pocket and the impossible memory of those disappearing tracks. These people were either insane or they knew something that I, in all my years as sheriff, had only ever glimpsed in the dark corners of my worst cases. Pine Creek had its share of drifters and eccentrics, but this was different. They carried themselves like soldiers entering hostile territory. They followed me inside without an invitation. I watched as they unslung their worn leather satchels on my kitchen table. The contents were bizarre, a collection of objects that felt like they belonged to another century. There were ornate, old-fashioned knives with silver filigree on the handles. There were dozens of small burlap pouches tied with string, which, when opened by Laura, released the dry, pungent smells of herbs I couldn't identify. Wolfsbane, sage, and something else, something acrid and bitter. And there were more amulets, each bearing the same circular, tentacled sigil. "Silver is a constant," Laura explained, her voice soft but firm, noticing my stare. "It holds a purity the earthbound things can't tolerate. The herbs, they confuse the senses. Not ours, theirs." Andrew, the boy, said nothing. He just stood by the window, his vacant eyes fixed on the forest, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. My skepticism was a heavy shield, but they were chipping away at it with every word. I was a man who believed in evidence, in things you could photograph and bag and file away. But the totem, the amulet, the earth groans, they didn't fit in an evidence locker. "How do you know about what's happening here?" I demanded. Mark didn't answer directly. He simply asked, 10 years ago. 3 people vanished. A hiker in April, a teenager in May, a hunter in October. Tracks ended cold. No bodies ever found. The case file was thin, full of dead ends. You were the sheriff. You ran yourself ragged and found nothing. He recited the details of my greatest failure, a case that had chewed me up and spit me out, a case that had pushed me into this self-imposed exile. He knew the dates, the names, information that was never released to the press. "How could you possibly know that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. That's when Mark unrolled the map. It was a topographical survey of the county, old and creased. On it were red pins, 3 from 10 years ago and a new one, freshly placed. "Jacob Grayson," Mark said, tapping the new pin. "Every disappearance has happened on this trail. It's a feeding path." He then took a pen and drew a circle connecting the dots. The line was almost perfect, and in the dead center of that circle was a place I knew all too well, a place that had been a scar on this landscape for half a century. The old Huntsman Mine. "The disappearances aren't random," he said. "They form a perimeter, a territory. And that old mine, that's the den." Laura finally looked at me, her eyes intense. "The totem you found," she said, her scarred hands tracing the sigil on her own amulet. "It's a ward. But it's also a warning. It's not meant to keep people out. It's meant to tell the thing inside that the person who passes is spoken for, part of the land. The boy wasn't. He was an outsider on their path." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "The totem means the soil is waking up. It's more than just waking up. It's rotted from the inside out. The groans people hear, that's the sound of it stretching, The air in my cabin felt thick, suffocating. Everything they said was insane, the ramblings of a backwoods cult. But it fit. It fit the missing pieces of a puzzle that had haunted me for a decade. Mark looked at me, his expression grim. "We need your help, Wes. You know this land better than anyone, but more than that, you're connected to this." He tapped the center of the map again, right on the Huntsman mine. 10 years ago, you were desperate for a lead. You went poking around that old mine, didn't you? Moved some of the old stones the first settlers put there, thinking they were just a property line. You were looking for a body. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You didn't know what you were doing. You didn't find a body, but you broke something. You unlatched a cage that had been sealed for generations. You disturbed the right order of things. This started with you, Sheriff. It's only fitting you help us finish it. Mark's words hit me like a physical blow. He was right. I remembered that day with a clarity that felt like acid in my stomach. Frustrated, exhausted, and haunted by the faces of the missing, I had followed a hunch out to the old Huntsman mine. I'd found a semicircle of large, moss-covered stones near the sealed entrance, stones that seemed too deliberately placed to be natural. Thinking they might mark a clandestine grave, I'd spent an entire afternoon with a shovel and a crowbar, moving them, digging beneath them. I found nothing but packed earth and roots. I had dismissed it as another dead end. Now the memory felt like a confession. The history of the mine was common knowledge in Pine Creek. It was a silver lode that went bust in the early 1900s, finally shutting down for good in the 50s after a catastrophic collapse. A dozen men were in the deep shafts when the tunnels gave way. The company deemed a recovery effort too dangerous and too expensive. They sealed the entrance with concrete and steel, entombing the miners forever. Their bodies were never recovered. The place became a local ghost story, a monument to corporate greed and a warning to stay away. It's not the source, Mark said, as we stood before the rusted, graffiti-scarred gate that barred the way to the mine entrance. The air here was still and heavy, the silence of the woods more profound. The thing is older than any mine. The mine is just a wound in the earth, a place where the skin is thin. It's a doorway, a convenient point of entry and exit. Laura ran a scarred hand over the cold metal of the gate, her expression unreadable. Andrew stood a few feet back, his gaze fixed on the dark hillside where the mine entrance was a black maw. He was shivering, though the afternoon was mild. The gate was secured with a heavy chain and a modern lock, courtesy of the county. It took me less than 5 minutes with a set of bolt cutters from my truck. The snap of the chain echoed unnaturally in the quiet clearing. The entrance itself was a gaping hole in the rock face, sealed with a thick slab of concrete and a heavy, riveted steel door. But time and neglect had done their work. The concrete was cracked, and the lower corner of the steel door had been bent outward, leaving a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Fresh scratches marred the rusted metal around the opening, long, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by something impossibly strong, dragging itself through. "It's been active recently," Laura whispered, pointing a thin finger at the marks. They weren't from an animal. The spacing was wrong, and the metal looked like it had been peeled back, not clawed. It was as if something had pushed its way out from the inside. Slipping through the gap was like entering a tomb. The air hit us first. It was thick, cloying, and unnervingly damp. It smelled of deep, wet earth, of rot and decay, and something else, a faint metallic tang like old blood. The strangest part was the dampness. Pine Creek had been in a mild drought for the better part of a month. The creeks were low, the ground was hard and dusty. But in here, the rock walls wept with moisture, and the air was so heavy with humidity, it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. We clicked on our flashlights, their beams cutting sharp cones through the oppressive darkness. The main tunnel stretched before us, supported by rotting timbers. The floor was littered with debris, but it was the walls that drew our attention. They were covered in the same kind of scratches we saw on the door, long parallel gouges that ran along the rock at about waist height. They looked organic, less like tool marks and more like the tracks a snail leaves on a leaf, only on a monstrous scale. We moved deeper. The only sounds the crunch of our boots on the gravelly floor and our own ragged breathing. The silence in the mine wasn't empty. It was watchful. It felt like we were walking down the throat of some colossal sleeping beast. After about 200 feet, we came to a section where the main tunnel had collapsed, the way forward blocked by a mountain of rock and splintered timbers. This was the spot from the official reports. But something was wrong. A low rhythmic sound was coming from behind the rockfall. It wasn't a mechanical hum or the drip of water. It was a slow, deep, impossibly resonant sound, like air being drawn into a lung the size of a cathedral. Inhale, exhale. The very rock beneath our feet seemed to vibrate with each cycle. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and settled deep in the chest, a primal thrum of life where there should only have been dead stone. Suddenly, Andrew gasped. We turned our lights on him. The boy's eyes had rolled back in his head, showing only the whites. His body was rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He began to speak, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was a low, guttural whisper, a chorus of voices speaking as one, rasping and dry like dirt being sifted through a sieve. So hungry, so long in the dark, he hissed, his head lolling to one side. The ground wants new bodies. It wants to remember what it's like to be warm. It needs to feed, to grow. His head snapped up, his unfocused eyes staring directly at me. The stonebreaker. He opened the door. He let the hunger out. Mark rushed to the boy's side, grabbing his shoulders.
Andrew! Fight it. Don't let it in.
He pulled one of the burlap pouches from his belt and crushed it under the boy's nose. The sharp, bitter scent filled the tunnel, and Andrew choked, his body convulsing. He collapsed into Mark's arms, his eyes fluttering back into focus, filled with a terrifying, vacant confusion. He looked around the tunnel at us, as if seeing it all for the first time. What happened? He stammered, his voice his own again. Laura knelt beside him, her face etched with a grim mixture of pity and resolve. She looked up at me, the beam of her flashlight illuminating the weary lines around her eyes. He's a sensitive, Mark said, his voice strained as he helped the boy to his feet. He was born near a place like this. The connection, it was always there. He doesn't just hear the whispers from the deep places, Sheriff. He feels the hunger of the soil. He feels it like it's his own. Leaving the suffocating confines of the mine was like being born again. We emerged into the late afternoon sun, blinking, our lungs burning for clean air. The deep, rhythmic breathing from within the mountain faded as we moved away, but the memory of it clung to us, a persistent, unnerving hum in the back of our minds. Andrew was pale and unsteady, leaning heavily on Mark as we walked. "It doesn't stay in the mine," Mark said, consulting his creased map again. "That's just the lair. It hunts. The trail where the boy disappeared is its main artery, but it has other places it favors. places where the earth is softer. He pointed to a shaded area on the map, a few miles north of the mine. Grace Hollow, an old ravine. The ground there has always been strange. It took us the better part of an hour, pushing through dense undergrowth and over fallen logs, to reach the rim of the hollow. The place was aptly named, but its grace was of a dark, primeval sort. It was a deep, bowl-shaped ravine filled with ancient Douglas firs, their colossal trunks blocking out most of the daylight, creating a perpetual twilight at the bottom. The air was cooler here, and the ground underfoot was oddly spongy, yielding with every step like a thick carpet. It was quiet, too. The usual forest chatter of birds and insects was absent, replaced by a profound, listening silence. It was a place that felt like it was holding its breath. As we descended into the gloom, a strange detail caught my eye. The bark of the massive firs was streaked with a dark, viscous substance. It wasn't sap. It was almost black, and it glistened wetly in the dim light. I reached out and touched it. The substance was thick and oily, and it carried a sharp, coppery smell, like rust and blood. "Don't," Laura warned, her voice sharp. She pulled a cloth from her pack and wiped my hand clean. "It's a secretion, a residue. The creature exudes it when it moves close to the surface. It helps liquefy the soil, makes it easier to pass through. It's poison to anything that lives." She was right. I looked around and realized that the ground at the base of these trees was barren. No ferns, no moss, no life at all. Just black, oily soil. We spread out, moving slowly through the cathedral-like silence of the hollow. It was Andrew who found the first sign of Jacob Grayson. He stopped, his vacant gaze fixed on a patch of disturbed ground near the base of a particularly large fir. There, half buried in the soft earth, was a blue nylon backpack, its strap torn clean through. It was Jacob's. Kowalski's search party had missed it. They wouldn't have thought to look this far off the main trail. The ground around the backpack was a mess of churned soil and a more concentrated patch of the black, oily residue. And in the center of it was a depression, a soft, sunken pit about 4 feet in diameter. It looked exactly like a spot where someone had been standing before the ground simply gave way beneath them, swallowing them whole. "This is its method," Mark said grimly, poking at the edge of the pit with a stick. The earth yielded with a wet, sucking sound. "It doesn't hunt on the surface. It hunts from below. It senses the vibrations of footsteps, the weight, the life. Then it changes the consistency of the soil, turns solid ground into a slurry, a quicksand. The victim falls through, into a waiting maw. No struggle, no screams. Just gone." He looked from the pit to the torn backpack strap. It must have snagged on a root on the way down. The clinical way he described it was more horrifying than any monster story. It was predatory, efficient, and utterly alien. I knelt by the pit, the smell of damp earth and that metallic taint filling my nostrils. Something glinted in the disturbed soil at the edge of the depression. I reached in, my fingers closing around a small, familiar object. I pulled it out and wiped the dirt away on my jeans. My breath caught in my throat. It was my old sheriff's badge, not the one I'd turned in, but my original one, the one I'd lost a decade ago during that first frantic search. I remembered the exact moment it happened. I'd been scrambling down a steep embankment not far from here. The clasp must have broken, and it was gone. I'd searched for an hour before giving up. It had been buried under 10 years of leaf litter and soil, and now, here it was, pushed back to the surface as if the earth itself had regurgitated it. A wave of dizziness washed over me. This wasn't a coincidence. Nothing about this was a coincidence. The badge, the broken circle of stones, my presence here and now, it was all connected. The hunters hadn't just come to Pine Creek because a boy went missing. They had come for me. The creature, the land, this entity. It remembered me, the Stonebreaker, the one who let the hunger out. I stared at the tarnished silver star in my palm, and for the first time I understood. This wasn't just the town's problem anymore. It wasn't about a cold case. This was my personal haunting, bubbling up from the dirt to drag me down. My past wasn't just connected to this thing. It was anchored to it, and the anchor was pulling tight. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy of Grace Hollow, Mark made the call. We can't make it back to the road before dark, and I don't want to be moving through these woods at night. We make camp here. It was a decision born of necessity, but the thought of spending the night in this silent, watchful place made my skin crawl. We chose a small, relatively flat clearing a few hundred feet up from the hollow's floor, a spot that felt marginally less oppressive. We didn't risk a fire. Instead, we laid out our bedrolls and ate cold rations in near silence, the only light coming from a pair of battery-powered lanterns that cast a feeble, sterile glow. The silence was absolute, a heavy pressing weight that made every snapped twig or rustle of leaves sound like a gunshot. I tried to sleep, but my mind was a churning mess of images. The disappearing tracks, the scratches on the mine door, my old badge lying in the dirt. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that sunken pit in the ground, imagining Jacob Grayson's terror in the moment the world dissolved beneath his feet. I must have drifted off, because the vibration was what woke me. It was subtle at first, a low-frequency hum that seemed to travel up from the ground, through my sleeping bag and into my bones. It was the same rhythmic pulse we'd heard in the mine, but fainter, more distant. Thrum, thrum, thrum. The sound of a sleeping heart, deep in the earth. I sat up, my own heart hammering against my ribs. In the dim lantern light, I saw Mark and Laura were already awake, their expressions tense, their silver-handled knives in their hands. Then Andrew cried out, a thin, terrified whimper. He was thrashing in his sleeping bag, his eyes wide with panic. The ground around him was moving, not shaking, but writhing. From beneath the layer of pine needles and soft soil, dozens of thin, pale tendrils were emerging. They looked like roots, but they moved with a deliberate, muscular grace, coiling and uncoiling like a nest of white snakes. They weren't fibrous and woody. They were slick and moist, the color of grub worms, and they were weaving themselves around Andrew's legs, tightening their grip, trying to pull him down. He kicked and struggled, but they were strong, shockingly so. "It knows he's here," Laura hissed. "It's trying to take him." She didn't hesitate. Scrambling to her pack, she pulled out a leather pouch and flung a fistful of its contents onto the writhing mass. It was a fine, shimmering powder. The moment the silver dust touched the roots, they recoiled as if burned. A faint, sizzling sound filled the air, and a foul, acrid smoke like scorched meat rose from the ground. The roots writhed in agony, retracting back into the soil with astonishing speed, leaving behind blackened, scorched trails on the forest floor. Mark hauled a trembling Andrew to his feet, away from the contaminated ground. The boy was hyperventilating, his face ashen. The vibration beneath us slowly faded, and the hollow returned to its dead silence. We didn't try to sleep again. We just sat there, backs against a tree, waiting for the dawn. Sometime in those dark, watchful hours, I fell into a dream state, a waking nightmare. I was standing in the woods again, but I was younger, wearing my old sheriff's uniform, the star on my chest gleaming. I was standing at the edge of a freshly dug pit, not the small one from the hollow, but a massive raw wound in the earth. And it was full of bodies. The hiker, the teenager, the hunter from 10 years ago. Jacob Grayson. All of them, their limbs intertwined, their faces peaceful, as if they were sleeping. The ground around them was pulsing, and the pale, worm-like roots were gently cradling them, slowly drawing them deeper into the soil. A figure in a dark, heavy cloak stood on the other side of the pit, their face obscured by shadows. The figure raised a hand and pointed at me, and a voice echoed in my head, a voice that sounded like shifting gravel and rustling leaves. "You hear the call, Stonebreaker. You have always heard it. The land remembers its children." I woke with a jolt, the phantom voice still whispering in my ears, my clothes soaked in a cold sweat. The sun, when it finally rose, felt like a pardon. As we packed our gear, the tension from the night still hanging thick between us, Mark finally looked at me, his face grim. "I wasn't entirely honest with you, Wes," he said, his voice low. "It wasn't just that you moved the stones. That circle you broke. It was a seal, an ancient one, not designed to keep the creature in, but to placate it. The old settlers, the ones who first came to this valley, they understood what lived here. They made offerings. They built the circle as a focal point, a place of power to keep it dormant, to satisfy its hunger without taking lives." He sighed, the sound heavy with regret. "When you broke that circle looking for graves, you severed that connection. You stopped the flow of energy that was keeping it asleep. You didn't just unlock the cage. You starved the beast. And now it's awake and ravenous." His confession landed squarely in my gut, knocking the air out of me. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't an accident. I was the cause. My desperation, my obsession with a case I couldn't solve, had unleashed this nightmare on my town. The 3 people who vanished 10 years ago, Jacob Grayson now. Their faces flashed in my mind. Their blood was on my hands. The weight of that realization was staggering, a physical pressure that threatened to crush me. I wasn't just a haunted ex-sheriff anymore. I was the architect of this horror. "The first settlers didn't try to fight it," Mark explained as we walked, his words painting a grim picture of Pine Creek's hidden history. "They learned to coexist. They made a pact. They built a place to honor it, to listen to it." He pointed on his map to a small, unassuming square on the far side of the forest, miles from the town itself. An old chapel, St. Giles in the Wood. It hasn't been used in a century, not for any services the town would recognize anyway. The idea of a church dedicated to a subterranean entity was blasphemous, but after the night we'd just had, my capacity for disbelief was shot. If roots could come alive and the ground could breathe, a backwoods cult seemed positively mundane. The chapel was almost completely reclaimed by the forest. Ivy choked its stone walls, and a thick blanket of moss covered the sagging roof. The steeple had collapsed long ago, and the bell lay half buried in the dirt, green with verdigris. The heavy oak door groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing a single, cavernous room thick with the dust of ages. What little light pierced the grimy, stained glass windows illuminated a scene of eerie preservation. Rickety pews were still arranged in neat rows. An altar stood at the far end, carved from a single massive piece of dark wood. But this was no Christian church. The walls were covered in faded, painted symbols. The dominant one, repeated over and over, was the same circular, tentacled sigil from the amulets, but there were others. Complex, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe if you stared at them for too long. The air was stale, but beneath the dust there was a faint, lingering scent of beeswax and burnt herbs. Someone had been here, recently. On the stone altar, a collection of objects was carefully arranged, a bowl filled with rich black soil, a scattering of deer vertebrae, and a single petrified mushroom. Laura ran a finger over the altar's surface, then held it up. No dust. Someone touched this within the last day or two. It was a chilling thought, that we weren't the only ones who knew about this place. In a small sacristy behind the altar, we found what we were looking for. A heavy, leather-bound ledger sat on a wooden lectern, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The script was elegant, if slightly mad, a looping cursive that detailed the activities of the chapel's congregation. The first entry was dated 19 January. The colonists, led by a man named Elias Kane, wrote not of God, but of the hunger below, the shadow that walks beneath the soil. They described the earth groans, the soft spots in the ground, the disappearances of livestock. They believed the entity was a guardian spirit, a primordial god of the earth that required appeasement. They called themselves the Callers, for they claimed that on quiet nights they could hear its voice whispering to them from the ground, a silent call that resonated in their bones. The journal detailed their rituals, their offerings, grain, livestock, and in lean years, the willing sacrifice to feed the soil and ensure the harvest. It was a chronicle of a pact made in terror and desperation. They weren't worshipping it, Laura murmured, her face pale as she read over my shoulder. They were bargaining with it. They were trying to keep it sated so it wouldn't turn on them. She flipped to a later section where the writing grew more frantic. A schism had formed in the group. Some believed greater sacrifices were needed, while others sought a way to put the entity to sleep permanently. The journal ended abruptly in 1923, the last page filled with a single, frantically scrawled phrase. It demands too much. It is never full. They must have sealed it away, Mark concluded. The circle of stones at the mine. It wasn't an altar. It was a lock. They finally found a way to silence it, a lock I'd carelessly broken. As we were about to leave, Andrew, who had been silent the entire time, spoke up. "They're still here," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the chapel's doorway. "The ones who listen." We stepped outside into the failing light. The forest, which had seemed empty moments before, now felt crowded. And there were signs we'd missed on our way in. A freshly broken branch on a nearby sapling. A partial footprint in a patch of mud not made by one of our boots. We weren't alone. Someone had been watching us. Night fell with a suddenness that felt unnatural. We were making our way back toward the main trail when the woods around us came alive with light. Not the clean, white light of flashlights, but the flickering primal orange of torches. Figures emerged from between the trees, moving with a silent, unnerving confidence. There were at least a dozen of them, their faces hidden behind crude masks made of woven bark, moss, and animal bone. They carried primitive weapons, sharpened spears, heavy wooden clubs. They fanned out, surrounding us, their torchlight casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the trees. They were the descendants of the Callers. The pact had not been broken. It had merely been passed down through the generations, a dark inheritance of faith and fear. The cult of the hungry earth was still very much alive. The circle of masked figures tightened around us, their silence more menacing than any threat. They held their torches and spears with a grim familiarity, their masked faces turning us into intruders in our own world. There was no sound but the crackle of the flames and the rustle of our own tense breathing. Finally, one of them stepped forward. The figure was smaller than the others, and when they pushed back their moss and bark mask, I saw the face of a woman, perhaps in her late 40s, with severe, tightly bound hair and eyes that burned with a cold, fanatical light. "You are trespassers," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the night. "You carry the metal that offends the soil, and you walk the paths of the uninitiated. You have disturbed the sacred places." "We're just passing through," Mark said, his tone carefully neutral. He held his hands up, palms out, a gesture of peace that seemed utterly futile. "We mean you no harm." The woman let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of any humor. "You have already done your harm." "The outsider," she said, her fiery gaze landing on me. "The Stonebreaker has returned, and you," she looked at Mark and Laura, "you are the heretics, the ones who believe in silence and silver, not supplication." She introduced herself as Mary Beth Collins, and she spoke with the unshakable authority of a true believer. She claimed that their rituals, their small offerings at the hidden altar in the chapel, were all that kept the entity's hunger in check. Our interference, my past actions, had upset a delicate balance. The disappearance of Jacob Grayson, she claimed, was our fault, a price demanded by the land for our disrespect. "You're feeding it," Laura shot back, her voice tight with anger. "Don't you understand? Every offering you make, every ritual you perform, it doesn't placate the creature, it makes it stronger. You're not keepers, you're enablers." Mary Beth's face hardened. "It is you who are ignorant. The land gives, and the land must take. That is the true order, and the circle the first ones made, it was broken by him." Her finger, thin and accusatory, pointed directly at me. "The pact requires amending. The ground calls for a great sacrifice to restore the balance. The Stonebreaker must be given back to the soil." The other cultists shifted, their spears lowering, their intent clear. They were going to sacrifice me. To prove her point, Mary Beth led us, or rather forced us, to a small clearing deeper in the woods. This was their true place of worship. In the center of the clearing was a pit, similar to the one in Grace Hollow but far larger and deeper. It was a gaping maw in the earth, and its edges were lined with a thick, writhing lattice of the same pale, grub-like roots we'd seen the night before. They moved slowly, constantly, pulsing with a faint inner light. From the depths of the pit, a sound rose to meet us, a wet, dragging, respiratory sound. It was the breathing from the mind, but louder, closer, more immediate. It was the sound of the thing itself, lying just beneath the surface, waiting. "You see?" Mary Beth whispered, her eyes alight with ecstatic reverence. "It is awake. It is waiting. It has been promised." Mark stepped between me and the cult leader. "This is madness, Mary Beth. Your ancestors tried to stop this thing, not worship it. The ritual you're talking about will do the opposite of what you think. It won't put it to sleep. It will give it the strength to rise." He argued with a desperate passion, trying to reason with a faith that was beyond reason. He spoke of the journals, of the schism, of the final entry that spoke of a hunger that could never be filled. But his words were like stones thrown into a river. They made a brief splash and were swallowed by the current of her belief. The conflict erupted without warning. One of the cultists lunged at me with a spear. I sidestepped, the sharpened point hissing past my ear. Mark drew his silver knife, the polished metal glinting in the torchlight. The clearing devolved into a chaotic swirl of motion and shouting. But our fight was not just with the cultists. As the first sounds of struggle broke the ritualistic silence, the ground itself responded. The pale roots at the edge of the pit surged outward with terrifying speed, lashing through the air like whips. They wrapped around the ankles of two of the cultists, who screamed as they were dragged off their feet. The roots were impossibly strong, pulling the struggling men toward the pit as if they weighed nothing. Mary Beth, seeing her ritual descending into chaos, let out a cry of fury and despair. She raised her arms to the pit, chanting in a strange, guttural language, perhaps in an attempt to command the roots, to placate the entity. But the land was not listening to prayers tonight. A thick, muscular tendril, thicker than my arm, erupted from the ground directly at her feet. It coiled around her waist, lifting her clean into the air. She let out a single, piercing shriek of terror as she was pulled headfirst into the dark, breathing maw of the pit. Her scream was cut off with a sickening wet crunch. The sight of their leader being consumed by the very god she worshipped shattered the cultists' resolve. They broke, screaming in panic, dropping their torches and spears as they scrambled back into the darkness of the woods. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble violently. The entire clearing seemed to lose its integrity, the soil shifting and sinking like wet sand. The pit was widening, the earth around it collapsing inward. "Run!" Mark bellowed, grabbing Andrew, who stood frozen in horror. We turned and fled, not looking back, the sounds of sucking mud and snapping tree roots chasing us through the night. The very ground we ran on felt treacherous and unstable, a thin crust over a hungry, bottomless void. We ran blindly through the woods, the sounds of the collapsing clearing fading behind us. There was no plan, only a desperate flight from the roiling earth. When we finally stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, it was Mark who gave voice to our new, terrifying reality. "It's over," he panted, leaning against a tree. The cult, their rituals, they were a leash. A frayed, rotten leash, but a leash nonetheless. Mary Beth's death. The entity consuming its own high priestess. It broke the pact completely. There's nothing holding it back now. It's going to spread. A cold certainty settled in my gut. We hadn't just escaped a cult. We had witnessed the last chain break. The only option left wasn't containment. It was destruction. "The mine," I said, the words tasting like ash. "We have to go back to the source." The journey back to the Huntsman mine was a nightmare. The woods felt different, actively hostile. The ground seemed to groan under our feet, and twice we had to detour around patches of soil that had turned into black, bubbling mire. When we finally reached the entrance, the change was unmistakable. The air pouring from the gap in the steel door was no longer just damp and cold. It pulsed with a faint, sickly warmth, like the breath of a feverish animal. And from within, the rhythmic breathing was louder, faster, a frantic, hungry sound that spoke of a creature on the verge of emergence. Inside, the mine was no longer just rock and shadow. It had been transformed. The walls were now coated in a thick, pulsating membrane of living tissue, veined with the same pale, grub-like roots we'd seen in the forest. The entire tunnel seemed to have become part of a colossal, organic system, and we were walking through its primary artery. The air was hot and thick, with the smell of wet soil and raw meat. The floor was slick with the black, oily secretion, making every step treacherous. We pushed deeper, following the tunnel not to the collapse, but down a side shaft we hadn't noticed before, a passage from which the rhythmic pulsing seemed to originate. This new tunnel descended sharply, spiraling down into the guts of the mountain, It ended in a vast, cavernous chamber, a natural grotto that must have been hidden for millennia. The sight that greeted us stopped us dead in our tracks. The chamber was the creature's nest, or its heart. The walls throbbed with a slow bioluminescent light, casting the entire cavern in a ghastly, pale glow. And the bodies were here. Not just the miners from the 1950s, their forms little more than skeletons wrapped in rotted coveralls, but the more recent victims as well. The hiker, the teenager, the hunter, and lying nearest to us, Jacob Grayson. They were all suspended in a grotesque vertical tableau, encased in a web of thick, translucent roots. Their eyes were closed, their faces placid, and they were warm. A faint vapor rose from their skin. They weren't just being held, they were being incubated. In the absolute center of the cavern, hanging from a thick bundle of roots descending from the ceiling, was the source of it all. It was a cocoon, a massive, teardrop-shaped pod of woven roots and pulsating organic matter. It was easily 12 feet tall, its surface glistening and shifting as if something massive were stirring within. A thick, black, tar-like fluid, the same substance we'd seen on the trees, slowly dripped from its tip, pooling on the cavern floor. The rhythmic breathing, the heartbeat of the entire mountain, was coming from this thing. It was gestating, growing, preparing to be born. Just as the sheer horror of the scene was settling in, Andrew let out a choked cry. He stumbled forward, his hands pressed to his temples. "It's here," he gasped, his voice strained. "It knows we're here. It's calling." His body went rigid and his head snapped up. This time there was no rolling of the eyes, no trance-like state. His eyes were wide open, but they were no longer his. They glowed with the same faint, pale light as the cavern walls. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face, a rictus of alien intelligence. "The children of the soil have come to feed the mother," he said, his voice a layered, resonant chorus that echoed through the chamber. "The Stonebreaker will be the first meal. His strength will be her strength." The entity had done more than just whisper to him this time. It had taken him over completely. The roots encasing the bodies on the walls began to tremble and writhe. The ones covering the chamber walls detached, whipping through the air toward us like living tentacles. "It's using him as an anchor," Laura shouted, shoving me back as a root slammed into the spot where I'd been standing. "A conduit to this world." I looked from the possessed boy to the grotesque, pulsing cocoon. This wasn't just a monster hiding in a cave. This was a womb, and the thing growing inside it was about to wake up. Mark raised his silver knife, its clean metal a stark contrast to the organic corruption surrounding us. His face was a mask of grim determination. "There's only one way," he said, his eyes fixed on the cocoon. "The heart must be destroyed. It's the only way to kill the body." He knew, and I knew, that getting close to that thing was a suicide mission. But as the roots began to tear themselves from the walls and slither across the floor toward us, I realized he was right. We had no other choice. Mark didn't wait for a signal. With a guttural yell that was equal parts fear and fury, he charged. He vaulted over a slithering mass of roots on the cavern floor and ran directly toward the immense pulsating cocoon. The chamber responded instantly. Roots erupted from the walls and floor, a forest of pale, whipping tendrils converging on him. He ducked and weaved, his movements surprisingly agile for a man his age, his silver knife held high like a torch in the ghastly gloom. He was a man with nothing left to lose, driven by a purpose that transcended survival.
"Wes, the boy!" Laura screamed, pulling me back toward the tunnel entrance. We have to break its hold on him.
She began frantically pouring her remaining silver dust onto the floor, creating a wide, shimmering circle around us. As she worked, the possessed form of Andrew turned its attention from Mark to us. "The silver ring will not protect you from the earth itself," the chorus voice boomed from the boy's mouth. He slammed his foot onto the ground, and the rock beneath Laura's circle cracked, a fissure of darkness spreading through the shimmering powder, breaking the integrity of her ward. The roots that had been held at bay now surged forward, ignoring the silver. While Laura desperately tried to mend the break in her circle, I faced Andrew. It was like looking at a stranger wearing a familiar mask. The cruel intelligence in his eyes was ancient and terrifying.
"Andrew, fight it," I yelled, my voice sounding small and useless in the vast breathing cavern. "This isn't you." The thing wearing his face just smiled. "There is no Andrew. There is only the hunger."
It lunged at me, its movements unnaturally fast. I sidestepped, grabbing the boy's arm. The strength in his small frame was shocking, like trying to hold onto a steel piston. He twisted in my grip, his fingers digging into my arm like claws.
"The mother is birthing," he shrieked, his head thrashing from side to side, "and you will be her first taste of the new world."
Across the cavern, Mark had reached the cocoon. He plunged his silver knife deep into its fleshy, pulsating surface. The reaction was immediate and violent. The entire chamber convulsed. A high-pitched psychic scream echoed in our minds, a sound of pure agony and rage. The cocoon erupted, not with blood, but with a torrent of the black, tar-like fluid. It sprayed across Mark, who cried out as the substance smoked and sizzled on his skin, eating through his clothes like acid. He staggered back, but then, with a final, desperate roar, he drove the knife in again, up to the hilt, twisting it with all his remaining strength. The roots that had been attacking us and holding Mark at bay suddenly went rigid. The psychic scream intensified, and then as one, the tendrils abandoned their targets and whipped back toward Mark, converging on him in a furious, writhing mass. They wrapped around his limbs, his torso, his neck, lifting him from the ground. I saw his face for one last fleeting moment, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with a kind of grim triumph. Then the roots tightened, and he was pulled apart with a series of sickening, wet, tearing sounds. The last thing to fall was the silver knife, clattering to the stone floor. But his final attack had done its work. A massive, gaping wound had been torn in the side of the cocoon. The black fluid poured out, and the entire pod began to deflate, shuddering and spasming like a dying animal. The pale light in the cavern flickered wildly. The ground shook violently, and huge cracks began to spiderweb across the ceiling. Rocks and chunks of the organic membrane rained down around us. The entire mine was coming down, the creature's death throes causing a total structural collapse. The hold on Andrew broke. The alien light in his eyes vanished, and he collapsed, unconscious, into my arms.
"Wes, now!"
Laura yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the exit. We scrambled back up the sloping tunnel, the roar of the collapsing cavern at our heels. Dust and debris choked the air, our flashlight beams cutting frantically through the swirling chaos. We burst out of the mine entrance into the cool night air just as the entire hillside above the entrance gave a final titanic groan and slumped inward. The steel door, the concrete slab, and tons of rock and earth cascaded down, sealing the Huntsman mine forever, burying its horrors under a mountain of stone. We lay on the ground, gasping, covered in dust, listening as the last rumbles faded into a profound and absolute silence. The breathing of the earth had finally stopped. In the weeks that followed, Pine Creek slowly returned to its sleepy version of normal. The official story, expertly crafted by state geologists and county officials, was that a localized seismic event had caused a catastrophic collapse of the long-abandoned Huntsman mine. Jacob Grayson's disappearance, along with the bizarre deaths of the survivalist group led by Mary Beth Collins, were tragically attributed to the instability of the area. It was a neat, clean explanation that allowed people to sleep at night. The town mourned, held a candlelight vigil, and then, as towns do, it moved on. The woods went back to being just woods. The silence returned. But for me, the silence was different now. It was no longer a peaceful blanket. It was the quiet of a predator holding its breath. Laura Fitch left 2 days after the collapse. We stood by her battered station wagon, the awkward silence hanging between us. "Is it over?" I asked, the question I was almost too afraid to voice. She looked toward the scarred hillside where the mine used to be, her expression weary. "We cut off the heart," she said. "The body will wither. For now. But things like this, they have deep roots, Wes. The roots of ancient things rarely die completely. They just go dormant. They wait for the soil to be fertile again." She placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip surprisingly firm. "The balance is broken. Someone needs to watch this place. The circle needs to be restored." With that, she got in her car and drove away, leaving me alone with her words and a responsibility I never asked for. Andrew Neal recovered, physically at least. A distant relative came and took him back to a city he barely remembered. I visited him once before he left. He was quiet, withdrawn, the vacant look mostly gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, haunted sadness. He didn't remember much of what happened when the entity had control. Only fragments, like a half-forgotten nightmare. "Sometimes," he told me, his voice barely a whisper, "when I'm lying in bed, I can still feel it. Not a voice, just a vibration. Way down deep in the ground, like a string being plucked. The thought that a piece of that thing might live inside him forever was a horror I couldn't dwell on for long." True to Laura's words, I took up the watch. Using the tattered journal we'd recovered from the chapel and Mark's detailed notes, I began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding the circle of stones. I hauled the rocks myself from a quarry miles away, breaking my back under the hot sun, arranging them in the precise pattern the journal described. It wasn't about worship or appeasement. It was about containment. It was a lock, a warning, a boundary line drawn in the dirt against something that should not be. I became the town eccentric, the crazy old ex-sheriff who spent his days building a meaningless rock garden in the woods. I didn't care. I knew what I was doing. I was paying a debt, a penance written in stone. The days bled into weeks, the weeks into months. The seasons turned. The ground remained still. The nights were quiet, filled only with the familiar sounds of the wind and the forest's true inhabitants. I allowed myself a sliver of hope, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, we had actually won. That Mark's sacrifice had meant something permanent. I had become a guardian of the border between our sunlit world and the dark, hungry things that slept in the deep places of the earth. It was a lonely vigil, but a necessary one. Then one morning I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee, just as I had 100 times before. The air was crisp, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for one thing. There, sitting on the top step, placed precisely where the silver amulet had been left for me all that time ago, was a small, new object. It was a totem, freshly made. It was carved from what looked like a pale, moist root, and its head was a chip of shale. It was bound together with glistening, fibrous tendrils that were still damp, as if they had just been pulled from the earth. It was a message, a reminder. The heart may have been silenced, but somewhere, deep beneath my feet, in the endless dark of the rotted earth, the roots were still growing.